for me, it's about really understanding the top level financial model, because the financial model is the thing that cuts through all of the fluff and the nice talk. So, what are those big targets? So, for example, the company I chaired and started in the UAE looked at what are the big targets. CO2, 70% of CO2 is created by gas generated electricity, which then most of which goes into air conditioning. So what can you do to improve the efficiency of air conditioning? And that was one element, and there's lots of other elements. But when you look at these elements, they're relatively complicated, but that gives you your proportionality, okay? Now, so that, and then the critical thing that we did was also to make sure that technology we were deploying was profitable as well, because that's what makes it sustainable, and also that's what makes it investable. So by getting those, that's our real differentiator, and one of the things that hasn't been talked about today is profit. So that's one of the things I raised in my talk today. And that profit really is sanity. If you can't make something for profit and sell it, for more than you bought it for, you don't really have a future of a business. So when you look at, for example, some of the solutions that have been discussed today around hydrogen, there's some real elephants in the room. People are saying, so this is the thinking behind the strategy, when we get the hydrogen cost down to below diesel, there's some fundamental problems with that, which are basic physics, which are not going to go away. You can't wish that problem away. And so hydrogen does play a part in the future, but it's not utopia. And these ideological solutions which the government have come up with, largely around hydrogen, electric vehicles and carbon capture, are all part of a solution, but as an ideology, they're extremely problematic and actually make things worse. So one of the odd things about having been through this exercise, set up a company in the UAE to do this, I've pretty much turned away from this because most of the technology actually makes this worse. So when you look at the end-to-end, right, with very few exceptions, that it pretty much makes it worse. So the amount of energy you're putting in, so if you take hydrogen, for example, to make hydrogen usable, you need to cool it to minus 270 degrees, and absolute zero is minus 273 degrees, if you remember in your chemistry lesson. And that's a lot of energy, and that's fundamental physics to take it from 19 degrees to minus 270. And that gets the energy density to put it into an aircraft, for example. And no one's quite sure what they do with it when they get it into an aircraft, but that requires a huge amount of energy. And of course, what's the big issue at the moment? Energy costs. And actually, to make this energy transition happen, actually the energy consumption is going to have to increase. And people justify the psychology about, they talk about green hydrogen, right? But actually, there's an opportunity cost there, because you could use that energy for something else to reduce fossil fuels rather than make hydrogen. Because you've got this, so it's about what are the choices you can make. So broadly, in summation, there are some technologies which make things better. So for example, electric vehicles, zero emissions aspect in a city is very important for short journeys. But when you look at the zero carbon footprint of an electric vehicle, 70% of the footprint of an entire internal combustion engine vehicle is made just making the battery in the electric vehicle. So from a zero carbon perspective, you've got a huge spike, and then you've got to run the thing, right? And the question is, where does that electricity come from to run that car? And what's the cost of running the car? And one of the challenges at the moment is that people are complaining about the cost of the electricity as it stands to run their electric vehicles. So these ideological solutions are extremely problematic. And when you look at things like, at a top level, carbon capture, end to end, we look basically the amount of energy you put in to capture the carbon, you wouldn't do it because it's a net. It requires so much energy to take it out, and the scale of it's so ridiculous. And actually there's a biblical aspect to this, and which actually matters because it's some sort of reference where there's no reference. Basically, Jesus said that, you look after the planet and I'll fix it for you. And we're moving into that sphere of this godlike, people are talking about artificial intelligence and really acting like God, the ability to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And just from a physics perspective, breaking a carbon dioxide molecule requires a lot of energy. So again, when you look at this technology, it really does need to be challenged very hard. It is part of a solution, but we need to be much more pragmatic. And I'm actually quite pleased to see the German government actually challenging coming back to the table and saying, look, we need to get internal combustion engines back on the menu, because for this relatively small benefit, 0.1% of global emissions are created through car transport in the UK. We're at risk of trashing 800,000 jobs in the UK, which is a huge cost. And of course, they're the people who are going to buy the vehicles. Now, these people, by making things, working in factories and working in industries, and people will just try and justify that as well. It's interesting, the psychology. Historically, when farmers made, in their fields, what they would do is there'd be an industry that, if someone invented a tractor, a whole new industry moved around tractors, and there was a whole new revenue stream. What's interesting about this new wave of technology, there's no new industries forming, okay, despite all the huffing and puffing. So electric vehicles, the complexity of electric vehicle, of the 800,000 versus the 800,000 people in the UK working, is probably 80,000 total. So what are the other 720,000 going to do? Artificial intelligence, another big question mark. When you look at all of these technologies, they're not creating new industries. So there's a very serious, one of my main drivers is because I'm an industrialist by background, I'm a manufacturing engineering type bloke, is actually a genuine interest in securing the future industrial capability in the UK, because that is the engine of the UK. That's where my passion is. Where does success look like for industrialisation in the UK? It's about not following these ideologies, right? It's about avoiding this simplification of electric vehicles, hydrogen and carbon capture, and getting some really good brains together to come up with hybrid solutions. Because when you actually look at the solutions, there are a bit of this and a bit of that, and actually that's where we'll win. Okay, that's where we'll be smarter than the competition, and that's where we'll find innovative ways of doing this properly and actually making money. And beating the competition. The problem is, if you deal with China on their own terms, they're 10 years ahead of you, both in terms of electric vehicles, not so much carbon capture, but and hydrogen. They're probably a little bit, but not a little bit ahead of us, but not massively ahead of us. But they have a completely different operating model, and if you operate on Chinese terms, you're going to lose, because we care about things societally that they don't care about, and also from one of the big challenges mentioned energy. They've dropped out of the climate agreement completely, so they have masses of cheap energy. So when I'm talking about making batteries, they can make batteries from coal, right, which is twice as bad as fuel energy made from gas, for example, which we talked about the UAE. So they're at a real premium. They've got an opportunity to just whitewash the entire industry, and they are. So there's a really important issue here to also make the right decisions for the UK to do things on our terms and win. And if you look at the way economies win and the way innovation actually happens, the harsh reality of this is that most of the ideas will fall by the wayside. So this notion of Startup UK, thousands of companies, from my experience, most of them need to be shut down. And then the very few, or the hybrid elements, by getting the right people together, looking at this in the right way, creating the right structure to look at the right technology with organisations such as Cranfield and others to really look at this, and all the government bodies which have been here today, then you've got half a chance of getting the financial model, future financial model, the different hypotheses in place, because people are boldly talking about being able to fix problems that they will not be able to fix at the moment. And if they do, they're going to face competition which they'll not win at. So the critical thing here is to understand what are the underlying assumptions. Okay, so fossil fuel consumption plays a part in the future of transport, right? Part of a strategy. It clearly has the downside, but in the UK, if you just look at it specifically, it's very important to be specific. It's only 0.1% of the global emissions. Okay. So is it the solution for the UK? Not, in terms of looking at fossil fuel consumption. No, it isn't particularly. What we ought to look at in the UK, right, if we want to save the planet, because we live in this whole planet thing, what we ought to look at, and this is part of the reason why I've taken a bit of a back seat on technology, is we ought to look at investing in countries where their economies are threatened by climate events, right? And those are not particularly extraordinary climate events, because people that the livelihoods that get washed away like Pakistan or Bangladesh living at sea level, they don't care about the environment whatsoever, right? So what we should be doing, in my view, is invest, one, protecting nature, right, first and foremost. That's what our natural environment is, the way we manage this stuff at the moment. That's our top priority. And secondly, the second priority is to actually invest in countries that their economies are under threat. That's what we should do, as well as reduce consumption. So in terms of, we've basically moved a lot of the problem to China, right? And we say, well, China are producing 30% of this global CO2, which they are. We need to dramatically reduce, for example, things like plastics. So part of the UAE strategy was reducing plastic consumption, which means recycling at source and all kinds of stuff. So those are the things we should be focusing on. That's where the money is when you look at the big ticket items. There are other things, and then it's a question of proportionality. So in the UAE, it's all about keeping heat out of buildings and air conditioning to keep them cool. In the UK, it's about keeping heat in buildings. So it's about how do you insulate houses. And that is another chunk which requires another chunk of focus. But at the moment, as I said, proportionality really matters because the UK economy, we have to earn money in order to buy things. And so if you look at the UK economy, there's a very simple equation, which I think 800,000 jobs currently rely on the UK automotive industry. We're proposing an industry which employs a lot less people for a very, almost negligible 0.1% improvement in carbon dioxide. The question is that the right thing to do? And that's the top level picture, which needs to be got right? And then you can decide what to do about it. But if we talk about nature, the big ticket item is the Amazon rainforest. There's been a government change in Brazil, which has been great news, but you've got a lawless situation in the Amazon rainforest. Somebody needs to get a grip with that. That's what we should focus on. That's where the money is, because the Amazon rainforest is 17% now depleted, and it's thought when it gets to 20%, it could become unstable, and actually the whole ecosystem of the Amazon might disappear, and that would be catastrophic. That's what we should be spending our money on. So actually, the really tough part of this is that most of this technology, for the reasons I've described, in other words, the energy going in, regardless of where it comes from, because again, remember the substitutional effect, you could use it for something more useful. The energy going in is far more detrimental than the benefit coming out. Yeah, green hydrogen. It's not green hydrogen. There's a lot of energy that goes in to produce hydrogen that could be used for something more. So the psychology of this is really important, because that creates a blind spot, because if you speak up against green hydrogen, actually it's green, but actually it's not, because you've got the substitutional effect. And actually energy consumption is going to rise, including fossil fuels, during this bit of time, because this infrastructure requires fossil fuels to build it. It isn't pixie dust that builds this, it's going to be fossil fuels. So the energy side of this, overall energy consumption, is a very big issue, and it's a very big issue now. Ground zero, where we are now, security of our energy, we've experienced this just recently. We haven't even really scratched the surface, and what we're proposing to do is actually switch off fossil fuels, which creates an absolute crisis from an energy availability perspective. The US have switched off they've got the biggest reserves of oil in the world. They've switched off a lot of their oil, and there's big geopolitical questions about should they buy it from Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia aren't playing ball at the moment, so siding with China. So energy is a very big issue. And be able to manage and supply your energy. And some of the assumptions that people are talking about, the amount of windmills or wherever this green stuff, people are talking about having to import that energy or import the hydrogen. And again, we won't be. If you run out of hydrogen, you run out of electricity, you're not going to be able to go anywhere. It'll just be switched off. We've seen the impact. We can see it's just disastrous. So we should focus on getting this top level plan right. Right. So my first port of call would be to get the great and the good together, and I know them. I've had discussions with Cranfield, who've got already links into industry, to actually identify the right technologies. So create a function at the right top level, including all the best brains, to challenge it, check it each way possible, some of which I've mentioned today, to make sure that strategy is right for the UK, and then that creates a top-level structure. It creates an investment structure that people can put money into. And then you need a delivery structure to deliver that, which is another gap in the UK economy. So at the moment, the proposal is to deliver that through local councils, and they haven't got the capability to do that. So the delivery aspect of this is also, in terms of the vendor management, finding people actually install or retrofit stuff into houses, whatever's the most important thing to do in the UK, and or external, take a broader perspective of this stuff. And we really do need to look at the profitability as well. You know, no one's talked about profit to get this model right. And it's not actually that difficult to do it. You can do it on the back of a fag packet. If you've got the right people around the table, you can come up with something pretty rough and ready. And just to have a target, just to get people to think about, introduce, you know, not just the zero emissions, but the profitability, the energy consumption, what's the implication on jobs in the UK, etc. Then I think, you know, we could be extremely successful. And also the good news is we've got all the raw materials. So we've got all of the people here today at this conference